Let me now talk a little bit about some specific examples. Okay? And probably the most common specific example is the two-input production function, right? That is, you guys take macro, so you obviously have seen this before. We think of output as being a function of two inputs, K and L, right? That is the two-input production function. That is, the amount of output we produce is a function of this aggregate we'll call capital, which is like all the machinery and stuff, and this aggregate we'll call labor, which is all the workers, okay? Often you might say, well, how do I measure it? Well, labor is measured in man hours. Capital is measured in what? What? Yeah, I mean, how do we measure it, though? How, if we had to come up with a capital stock for a company, how would we measure it? Replacement value, so dollars. So, is that the right way to think about it? Let's think about it. If I thought about the amount of output I would produce, okay? Why dollars? Well, what does the theory tell us? What if we had a bunch of different kinds of capital? What would tell me dollars worth would be a good measure? Well, it's going to be the same thing that told us dollars worth was a good measure in consumer theory. That is, the firm's going to equate the marginal products of all these things to their prices, and therefore something that costs twice as much has to produce twice as much on the margin. Right? You agree with that. Just like we said in the consumer theory, right? Why we wanted to measure hamburger and steak, we didn't just add pounds of hamburger to pounds of steak. We had to multiply by the relative price of the two different kinds of meat. Same is true for capital. But it's important to recognize that the prices that you would want to use to aggregate are not the capital prices, right? Whenever you talk about a capital good, there are two notions of prices. There's the capital price, and there's what we'd call a rental price. And the way we've set this up, what we want to think of as the cost of capital is the rental price, right? That is, we're going to measure our capital. So our maximization problem is going to be max P times F of L and K minus WL minus RK, where this is the rental price of capital. Right? All right. That's going to be our profit maximizing. Whenever you write down maximize value of output minus WL minus RK, what you need to think of is this is the rental price of capital. Okay? And if that's the rental price of capital, this has got to be a kind of rental equivalent. Right? Everybody understands that? That when I aggregate my 2 units of capital, I would say a truck is worth just as much as a factory if they rent for the same amount, not if they cost the same amount to purchase. Do you get that? This has to be in rental equivalents, too, to make this formula work. Yeah? Well, it depends. Yes. I mean, if the rental price doubled, then you would have to say in equilibrium, that means that that truck has to be twice as productive. Another way to think about it is $1 million worth of computers will not produce the same output that $1 million worth of factories will, right? Which one would have to produce more output, $1 million worth of computers or $1 million worth of factories? Which one's got to produce more output this year? Well, think about it. They both got to be worth $1 million, right? We're never going to change that. They both have to be, it has to be, people are willing to pay $1 million for the factory, and they're willing to pay $1 million for those computers. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The computer has to produce its $1 million worth of output over a few years because it's not going to be very useful after a few years from now. So, whereas that factory might be around for the next 30 years. So they're both going to produce $1 million worth of output, or at least expected to produce $1 million worth of output over their life. That is, the capital price measures the value of the asset over its life. The rental price is going to measure its value in terms of current use, which is what's going to go in here, right? Everybody understand that? This is current output. This is how many units of output are being produced, right? This production function is like output per month or output per year. It's some flow measure of output. So we need to be measuring all these things on a flow basis. So we want, if we're going to aggregate some computers together with some buildings to build my capital stock, I got to put both of them in there in terms of how much they contribute to today's output. If I want to talk about how much inputs a given amount of labor and capital can produce. Because that won't be the same for $1 million worth of purchased computers and $1 million worth of purchased factories. Right? Got to make them rental equivalents before you add them up. Not in that production function, it ain't. In that production function, if I want to say the amount of output I produce is a function of L and K, where I just measure the gross output of the firm, you got to make the K's in rental equivalents. That is, you aggregate them according to how productive they are on the rental market.
Yeah, but it is kind of strange. It seems that the K and L is the symmetry here. Why don't we do the same for L?
Oh, because L is usually rented. That is, for L, you wouldn't put in the price of a person. That is, the analog of the capital price of a piece of equipment is how much it costs to buy your labor services for your entire life. Instead, what I use in the labor market is I observe the rental price, right? That is, whenever I look at assets and I see their use in the market, sometimes I measure purchase prices, sometimes I measure rental prices, and they're not the same concept at all. The wage rate is not how much you pay to buy a person. It's how much you pay to rent them, right? When you hire a worker for a day or for a year or whatever, whether it's a salary for a year or a salary for a month or wage for an hour, it's a rental price. It's how much you're paying them for that specific time. When you see if you were renting your capital, then that would be analogous. If you're saying, well, in order to run my business, I got to lease a truck and I got to hire some workers and pay them on a monthly basis, then my monthly lease cost of the truck would be analogous to the monthly labor cost of the workers. But if you said, I'm going to buy an $80,000 truck, I can't say, well, that $80,000 goes into today's cost, because that $80,000 truck isn't going to produce all $80,000 worth of output today. It's going to produce $80,000 worth of output over its life. Whereas when you hire that worker for a monthly salary of $4,000, he got to produce his $4,000 in that month, because you don't have the right to use him for the rest of his life. Right? That's kind of the idea. I only bring this up because I know when people taught me about capital, they just always talked about capital as this like capital value, that like you just go to the firm's balance sheet, how much capital they got. Well, it's not what goes in this production function. Might go in some other production function, but doesn't go in this one. This one, if you're going to really think about how many widgets I produce or how many ears of corn I can grow per acre or some measure of output that I'm going to try to link this up to, it's got to be the rental equivalents. All right?
But it seems that in some macro research, they just use the statistics issued by the government and they plug them into K, right?
I don't know. Casey, how did they solve this problem in macro? Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because this becomes important when the composition of the capital stock is changing over time, as it has been. I mean, If you have fewer structures and more computers and software, well, that's going to really change this rental versus capital value relationship. $1 million worth of computers and software is going to have to get a lot more marginal product in the short term than will $1 million worth of buildings. There's just no question about it. I mean, and from a production point of view, you wouldn't need $1 million worth of computers and software to replace $1 million worth of buildings. Over the life of the assets, you would. If you wanted to replicate what the building could produce over its entire life, you would. But over today, you would need a lot less. You'd need a lot less. So I think sometimes it is ignored. I think as Casey says, sometimes when it's important, hopefully people take advantage of it or take account of it. All right? All right, but let's assume we've measured everything on rental equivalence, and we have our problem here. This is our two-input case, right? And I would say of the two approaches that people take, which is the direct approach, where we think about the production function, versus the indirect approach, where we think about the cost function, the two-input case is probably the major case where we actually come at it the direct way. Okay, we use the direct approach. And of course, the first order conditions are P times partial F partial L equals W, and P times partial F partial K equals R. Right? And you could think about those in terms of these two equations. Partial F partial L times P. Here's W. L star is the equilibrium level of capital. P partial F partial K. R K star. And so that would be a way to describe the firm's optimality choice, right? They would be choosing L and K to maximize profits, which means you have to simultaneously set the value marginal product of labor equal to the wage rate and the value marginal product of capital equal to the rental price of capital. So that would be the firm's problem. Okay? Of course, the tricky part of this problem, of course, is that this depends on K and this depends on L. So these are really simultaneous equations. Nonetheless, at the equilibrium, it has to